Hello? Hello? Number 14, Christianity in Africa. Are you ready? I'm really excited about this one. Been working on it all week. And before I got here as well. I want to begin by mentioning a scholar named Douglas Jacobson, whose work on the global Christianity, especially in Africa, I used for this lecture, as well as I think I have the book over here somewhere. Yeah. This book here, History of Christianity in Africa by Elizabeth Isiki. I don't know if I said her name correctly. And another couple of sources other than that. But it's certainly a subject that is very interesting. To begin with, a number of African Americans have looked down upon Christianity as something that Europeans forced on Africans as part of colonialism. And therefore, they argue that Africans should not, or African Americans should not be Christians, because it is the white man's religion. I've heard people say that. Maybe you have heard people say that. That certainly has been some attitude that you can understand people having. However, it's just not true. It's not true that Christianity only came to Africa when colonialism came to Africa. In fact, Christ himself lived in Africa. Our Lord himself went to Africa. In Matthew 2:13 to 15, we read, "Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, 'Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him.' And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, 'Out of Egypt I called my son.'" So, of course, Jesus was Jewish, but he did sojourn in Africa. Africa protected. It was a safe haven for our Lord when he was very young. He was a baby refugee, Jesus. In Mark 15:21, at the end of his life, we read, "And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross." Thus, Jesus was in Africa at the beginning of his life and was helped, literally, physically helped by an African at the end as well. Do you guys have blanks for those, or you already figured them out?
The first one I got Egypt, right? As baby Jesus living in Africa, Egypt.
Matthew.
It's right here.
Which is
Matthew
Matthew 2.
2:13 and 15. The other one is Mark. You see there?
Oh, I see.
Then you have beginning and end. Come on, stay with me. It's our last day. We can do this. We can stay united, and we can finish the course. Finish the course.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So that's interesting, right? Our Lord spent time in Africa, and it was Cyrene is a town in Libya, modern Libya. So it's North Africa as well. Let's talk about the first century church. At Pentecost, 2 African nations were represented. You ever see that list of nations on the day of Pentecost? It's the part you probably skip over very fast. But we read in Acts chapter 2, verses 8 through 10, "And how is it that we hear each of us in his own native language? Parthians and Medes, Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome." So, right from the birth of the official birthday of the church, if you want to call it Pentecost, or if you want to identify it as when Jesus began his ministry, whatever. My point is, right from the beginning, Africa is part of the story of Jesus. He lives in Africa. It's an African who helps him carry his cross. And then when Pentecost arrived, the Holy Spirit comes. There are Africans there who are witness of this probably Jews sojourning in Africa, but they're living there. And then the other verse there, really significant, Acts 13:1 says, "Now there were in the church at Antioch prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger." Interesting. Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, a lifelong friend of Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. So in particular, these two, Simeon, who's called Niger, which may be this same Simon of Cyrene who carried the cross, or maybe a different person, hard to say for sure, but Simeon, who's called Niger, and then Lucius of Cyrene. Both of them are in this really cutting-edge church in Antioch, where Africans are having fellowship with Jews and other Gentiles, right? That all happened in Antioch. So, did you guys catch your blanks there? See, Egypt and Libya there? Okay, good. All right, so then we move to talk about Egypt. So that's the biblical evidence, but beyond that, there's a lot more to say about the subject of Christianity in Africa. And I realize this is supposed to be only from the 1500s to today, but I just couldn't help myself. I couldn't help myself but mention that Christianity has been in Africa really from the beginning. So this is Egypt here. There was a thriving Christian community in Alexandria. That's this city at the north here in Egypt that lasted for many. It really started either in the 1st or 2nd century. I mean, very early, and it's still there to this day. Even though the country is over 90% Muslim, the Christians are still there, and they've been there since, either the 1st or the 2nd century. I'm sure they would claim the 1st century. By the 2nd century, the scriptures are already translated into Coptic. Coptic is the local language of Egypt. It's an Egyptian language written with Greek letters. Also, there were huge names that came out of Egypt, including Clement of Alexandria, who flourished in the 180s, Origen of Alexandria, who flourished in the early 3rd century and was the church's first systematic theologian. Arius lived in Alexandria, as well as Alexander, and when those two got into a conflict in 318, it caused the Trinitarian controversy that then raged for another 60 years till 381. The Coptic Church, the Egyptian church, the Coptic Church, broke away in 451 from the rest of the church, and you might call it Eastern Orthodox, other people might call it Catholic, but the rest of the church, the Egyptian church basically broke away in 451 because of Chalcedon. They produced many influential Christian theologians. Whether you agree with the Egyptian Christians or not, they are pretty controversial. And you can't deny that they were huge influencers in Christian thought. Now we move to the Sudan. Sudan, as you can see, is just the next country south of Egypt, right here, Sudan. And in Sudan, we know that Christianity spread in the 1st century because of the Nile River. Okay, so you can continue down the Nile River, and you will get to Sudan. And we'll talk more about that, as well as the Nubian kingdoms in just a minute here. All right, so the next and really the most exciting story as far as early Christianity in Africa goes is Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a really big deal when it comes to the history of Christianity in Africa. Of course, you know that the Ethiopian treasurer to Candace was converted by Philip in Acts chapter 8, right? You know that. He was the one in the chariot, and he is reading Isaiah 53, the best prophecy of the crucifixion of Jesus in the whole Old Testament. And Philip comes up to the chariot. He runs up to the chariot and says, "Do you understand what you're reading?" And the Ethiopian says, "How can I unless somebody explains it?" And he welcomed him into the chariot. So this guy was on his way back to Ethiopia, a very influential person, The treasurer is the person who's in charge of the money. Okay, so definitely a significant person. He was converted in the 1st century. Ethiopia does not have to wait for the missionary movement of the 1800s to get Christianity. It already has it in the 1st century, at least for one person. We don't know what the after story was there, if he was able to convert many people or he kept it to himself. We don't know. But we do know that by the 6th and 7th century, there was a significant movement of Christianity in Nubia, which is just south, or it would be probably in the area of Sudan there, and or northern Ethiopia, I'm not really sure, but there were 3 Christian kingdoms there. One was Nobatia, the other was Makuria, and the other was Alodia. By the 7th century, Makuria became powerful enough to prevent the Muslims from reaching the south. And you'll see how Eastern Africa is mostly Muslim, and then it just stops. And then the rest of the south is not Muslim. So this kingdom in Makuria in particular, which is what, like I said, in the 6th and 7th centuries, we have information about it. We have lists of kings, and the kings have taken biblical names like David and Solomon and things like that. Which brings me to King Ezana. King Ezana, Ezana, of the Aksumite kingdom. This is a really cool story. So this all went down in the 4th century. In the 4th century, a man named Frumentius and his brother were shipwrecked off the coast of Eritrea. If you're not sure where that is, Eritrea is right up here, right? So it's on the north end of Ethiopia, and then on the east end is what we call Somalia. This is the Horn of Africa, right? So the north there is Eritrea, where my favorite long-distance runner is from, Meb Keflezighi. Just a little plug for him. Of course, he's American because he immigrated here when he was a kid, but he's from Eritrea. Anyhow, totally unrelated. Frumentius shipwrecked over there and made it to the royal court. So I don't know where he was going. Maybe he was going to somewhere in Arabia. We don't really know. But he shipwrecked, and then he made it all the way to the royal court, and he preached, and he converted King Ezana and baptized him. I didn't see anybody write down the word baptized. You already wrote it?
It's written.
It's already there.
What do you mean it's written? Is it underlined?
Yeah.
Oh!
You underlined.
I forgot to blank it out there, so we'll have to fix. I'll put a little note to fix that.
Oh,
For the next class.
that's why you spelled the name Ezana, right? Because also
it's underlined too.
here.
Oh! I did this today, so it's a little rough. I need the proofreader to fix this. Ezana sent to the Patriarch of Alexandria to appoint a bishop. So that's interesting, right? So you're down here, you're in Ethiopia, and you're sending back up to Egypt because that's where Christianity is more established. And you're saying, hey, can you give us a bishop to like kind of run things down here? We need some training. We need some leadership. And so Athanasius did that. He appointed Frumentius Abuna Salama, or the Abuna or Archbishop of the Ethiopian Church. And so this is the standard where basically the Church of Egypt is going to be appointing bishops for the church in Ethiopia up until 1959 when they got their first patriarch and they were independent in that sense. All right, on to the Maghreb. Okay, Maghreb is the northern countries of Africa, including Algeria, Libya, Mauritania, Morocco, Tunisia, and Western Sahara. This is a region that today is extremely Muslim, but it was not always so. In fact, it was Christian before it was Muslim. Did you know that? These were what's called the Berber nations. B-E-R, Berber. And it was a very significant part of the Roman Empire and the ancient world. All these all these northern nations. In particular, the city of Carthage up there is where a lot of big historical events happened. Tertullian was from Carthage, and Augustine is from North Africa. I mean, there are huge names within Christianity that were native to this region. For example, in 180, there were martyrs of Scilly, which is near Carthage. We have historical records of them. In 203, Perpetua and Felicitas, two of the most famous Christian martyrs of the 3rd century. We know that Tertullian was in Carthage, and he is an extremely influential theologian of the 3rd century. Cyprian converted to Christianity in Carthage in 246. The Novatian and the Donatist groups were in North Africa in the 300s. And then most famous of all, the most influential Christian after Paul the Apostle, Augustine of Hippo, was a North African from 354 to 430 is when he lived. Now, there were Muslim invasions. In fact, Islam begins in the 600s, the 7th century. And already in 639, Egypt fell to the Muslims. Then, from 670 to 705, they conquered the whole region of northern Africa. From this point onward, Christianity in that region waned until it was nearly extinct by the 11th century, except in Egypt. Christianity had been so deeply rooted in Egypt that it could not go extinct, even to this day. Even to this day, yeah. But in the other regions, Christianity basically went extinct, where people either moved or converted to Islam. Christianity survived in Egypt and Ethiopia, but not the Maghreb. By 1400, by the year 1400, 1/3 of Africa was Muslim, the northern part, with most people practicing traditional African religions in the sub-Saharan regions of Africa. All right, now this brings us more to our period, looking at the 1400s here. This is a map of Portuguese trade and also colonies, and you can see that they were already making so many discoveries in the 1400s. For example, they established connection and trade with the Kingdom of Congo in the 1400s, and a king there named King Afonso, who reigned from 1506 to 1543, converted to Christianity and his whole kingdom. So if you're not sure, this is the region of the Congo right over here. It's where the equator is, just south of what we know as West Africa, is the Congolese region there. And so the Congo nation technically converted to Christianity in the 1400s, but throughout the 1600s and the 1700s, Christianity in the Kingdom of the Congo died out because of political instability, the slave trade, and their unwillingness to accept clerical celibacy, the idea that priests could not marry. They could not accept that. In the mid-1600s, we got a Dutch settlement in South Africa. I think many of you know that South Africa is, has a lot of Dutch people in it. The kind of Christianity that the Dutch brought is called the Dutch Reformed Church. This is from a few lectures ago on reformations on the continent. If you recall, there was a king who didn't appreciate the Pope telling him what to do, so he just made his whole country Protestant, and they formed the Dutch Reformed Church. And really, from then till now, I think that's been the major church in Holland. And when they expanded to South Africa, that's the major church that was down there too. So that's interesting. What happened there is that traders were regularly stopping at the Cape of Africa, on the south part of Africa, on their way to and fro to Asia. Okay, so if you want to go from Europe to Asia, there's no Suez Canal yet, so you've got to go all the way around Africa, and it's a convenient place to stop, to refuel, to get supplies. The tip of Africa, South Africa. So the Europeans settled there. They thought it was a good climate, and they brought Christianity with them. So the Cape Colony had Dutch settlers in the 1600s, mid 1600s. This is a kind of an anomaly in Africa because it's a African nation, but it's ruled by white people. There were three kinds of churches in South Africa. Initially, there were just white churches, which were in the we call the Afrikaners. That's like the Dutch people that are in charge. They're going to have white-only churches. And then, over time, they develop mission churches. And these are mixed churches where you have black and white, but they're led by white leadership. And then finally, they're developed in South Africa, African independent churches, which were black churches. And you know, the big issue in South Africa has been this racial tension where, you know, white people are dominating the politics, the governing, and over time, we'll talk about it at the end here, but Nelson Mandela was able to get out of prison, and he became the first black president of South Africa after apartheid fell. So, and that was in the 90s. Anyhow, let's just summarize a little bit from the 1400s to the 1800s. Christianity was introduced along the coast west, south, and east, including Madagascar, but had not spread much. So this is where we're at in 1885. You can see that the north, or not 1885. This is 1400. The northern region is all Muslim, and the southern region is African traditional. And then you do have pockets of Christianity in Egypt and Ethiopia to 1885, which now we've got these regions all along the west, the south, and the east that are having some Christian establishment there, but it's not really prolific before the 20th century. The 20th century is the African century. That's where all the action is. But before we get there, we need to talk about Nigeria, because their story relates to the 1800s, the Niger Mission, modern Nigeria, and that was run by this man, Samuel Ajayi Crowther. He lived from 1809 to 1891. At 12 years old, he was captured, along with his mother and brother, an entire village, by Muslim slave traders and sold to the Portuguese. I'm sure that was not a pleasant experience, right? To have to be captured with your family, with your whole village, and to be sold. So he was in a ship destined to go, I don't know, maybe to Portugal, maybe to one of these other islands that they owned. And before the ship could leave the port, the British Royal Navy came and boarded the ship and freed him and his mother. And that is because his mother was a descendant of King Abiodun of the Oyo people in what is today Nigeria. So he and his mother were able to escape. I don't know if the other people also escaped, if they put the whole thing, emptied the whole ship, or just took them out. But he definitely and his mother escaped, and they resettled in Freetown, Sierra Leone. While they're there in Freetown, they were cared for by the Anglican missionary group, CMS, which is Church Missionary Society. I had already mentioned this to you last lecture. This is one of those missionary groups that gets founded in the 1800s and that spreads Christianity far and wide on behalf of Protestantism. In 1825, Crowther committed and converted to Christianity. In 1826, he went to England to study for a year. In 1827, he returned to Freetown and attended college there at Fora Bay, and he studied Latin and Greek until in 1841, he went on his first expedition, the Niger expedition with James Shun. In 1842, he was ordained a minister after the mission in Nigeria. He came back to England. He was ordained a minister by the Bishop of London. In 1843, he returned to Africa with Henry Townsend, and he opened a mission in Abeokuta, the modern Ogun State in Nigeria. Sorry for my pronunciation. I'm doing the best I can, but I'm sure I mutilated the French names too. Yeah, my language skills are only so broad. In 1843, he returned with Henry Townsend, as I mentioned, and he began translating the Bible into the Yoruba language. It's interesting, in my other class this morning, I have 3 Nigerians in that class. And one of them, David, speaks Yoruba.
Yes.
That is his tongue. And so it's kind of famous because this is the language that got the Bible first in Africa. Right? So it has a prestige to it. It's not entirely true. It's not entirely true because in the 2nd century in Egypt they already got the Bible in their native tongue, in Coptic, right? But okay, so but it still sounds good. Yoruba, it's the first of the modern times, to get the Bible. But anyhow, so this Crowther was one heck of a pioneer and a gifted linguist. Like a lot of these other reformers that we saw, they were really good at languages. So was this guy here. He worked on a Yoruba dictionary. He published a grammar book, and he published a book of common prayer in Yoruba. Why would he do a book of common prayer? Well, he's Anglican. Church of England, right? So if you want to have a church in Nigeria, you're going to need a book of common prayer because that tells you how to do church. It tells you the liturgy, the words you're supposed to say during the service, the prayers that you're supposed to pray, and everything else. In 1852, he published a vocabulary of the Yoruba language in London. In 1957, he assisted Simon Jonas in publishing a primer for the Igbo language. In 1860, he published a primer for the Nupe language. In 1864, he published a full grammar and vocabulary for Nupe. In 1864, he also was ordained the first African bishop of the Anglican Church. I mean, this is huge. In a sense, he is just way, way ahead of his time. As we'll see, sadly. So he's always going back to England, and he's getting ordained, and he's publishing books. I mean, really a powerful person. So he's the first African bishop of the Anglican Church, the Church of England. Later, he received a Doctor of Divinity from the University of Oxford. A very accomplished man. In the mid-1880s, he finally finished supervising the translation of the Yoruba Bible, Bibele Mimo. Bibele Mimo. I don't know if that's how you say it or not, but that's what it looks like. It is the translation they use in Nigeria. In the late 1800s, however, English missionaries took control. So after, even really before Crowther died, the English reasserted their control. They didn't want Africans running their own country, I guess, for religious purposes. They insisted on a British style of doing things, and the mission in Nigeria really collapsed at that time. However, it expanded again later. I should mention this now, that there are so many Anglicans in Nigeria today that recently when the Anglican Church was voting, the Nigerian church is so numerous that they are now calling the shots more than Anglicans in England, because so many people in England aren't any longer part of the Church of England. They're secular, or they've joined other groups. So Nigeria is pushing England around, whereas in these times England was pushing Nigeria around. So that's, maybe they're getting them back, huh? Yeah. In 1885 to 1915, Africa was colonized by the British, French, and Dutch. And you can see here on this map that the dark blue is the French there, and the brown color is Great Britain. And where are the Dutch? Wait, I didn't say the Dutch, did I? Yeah, I did say the Dutch. Well, I guess the Dutch were in South Africa. It's interesting, though, because South Africa is actually considered to be English, and they do speak English there in South Africa. So I guess England must have taken it from the Dutch at some point. You can see also that Italy got in the mix. They got Somalia over here. And then look at Ethiopia. My goodness, if you're an Ethiopian, you're a proud person. You should be proud of that. All these dates you see here, all these dates you see here are the dates at which they got independence. Ethiopia is white because it was never colonized. I guess there was
Liberia.
a couple of years there, 1936 to 1941, when Italy occupied Ethiopia, because you can see Italy had conquered Eritrea and Somalia. So they occupied Ethiopia for a few years, but then they were able to get their independence again, so they don't even count that on the map here. And Liberia too, right? Seems like they were not colonized either. So, but then you have a lot of Spain, right? And, or not a lot, but a little bit of Spain and a little bit of Portuguese here. Mozambique. This is Malawi over here. Mozambique was colonized by Portuguese, which is why if you go to Mozambique, even to today, they speak Portuguese there. And some of these other smaller countries. But really, really incredible how European nations conquered. It's just astounding. They did that in North America, Central America, South America, Africa, Asia. And the Europeans, they just love to conquer and to extend their little kingdoms. Look at how much of this is French. It was astounding, right? And then this is England, and then the DRC is Belgium. Yeah, and Belgium was just terrible to them. Really just pulled all their resources out and treated the people badly. So a lot of this is just incredibly sinful, this whole colonization business. And it was all done for money. All done for money. The largest influence was France on the west coast. The second largest was Britain. Colonization, however, did enable missionaries to go more easily to these African countries because they had government headquarters in all these different countries. And so the missionaries would go there and they would set up schools and they would teach children literacy, how to read, and also Christianity. The increasing growth of African independent churches was a reaction against the missionizing of the colonial powers. By 1950, let me push that. There we go. 1950, south of the 10th parallel was now 1/3 Christian. In the 1960s and 70s, most countries became independent. Back to this map, so you can see these dates. They're some of them are in the 50s, but a lot of them are in the 60s or in the 70s when they gained their independence, which is good. Pro-independence. People run themselves better than somebody else runs them, right? Don't you think? All right, so just another little summary here. In the year 1900, 60% of Africa practiced traditional religions, 35% is Muslim, and 11% is Christian. All right, so you got those ratios down. By 2015, however, 50% is Christian, 42% is Muslim, and 7% is traditional religions. So Christianity switched places with traditional religions. Traditional religions had been 60%, and now Christianity is 50%. So really a huge, and this is just one century. This is just the 20th century. And look at this right here. That's the era of decolonization. A key moment where Christianity could now start to grow because it wasn't being associated with colonial power. It was now up to the people to decide on their own if they wanted to become Christian. So if this did not happen, who's to say if it would just grow a little bit as opposed to growing so much? Today, above the 10th parallel, it's 90% Muslim, and below the 10th parallel, it's 75% Christian. Now, maps of Africa in general are pretty unfair. Not unfair, but they're pretty confusing because you don't really see how much of the north is desert, right? So much of the north is desert because of the Sahara Desert that it looks like, oh wow, that's a really big area. Yeah, it is a big area, but so much of it is thinly populated because of the desert up there. So let me just show you ever so quickly a little map of Africa, and just show you what I'm talking about here. I mean, you can see that now. Even just that view right there, you can see it. But we'll go to the satellite. I mean, look at how much is just arid land up there. I mean, you come from Zambia down here, right?
Yeah.
It's pretty green down there,
Yeah.
according to this map. But up here, I mean, it's really just a tan country, right? Not to say that there are no people there, but it's just more thinly populated than other regions. So it's good to keep that in mind when you're looking at maps of Africa, right? All right, so let's talk about Africanizing Christianity and how there are significant differences in worldview between Christianity and Islam, okay? So let's talk about worldview for a moment here. The Western worldview is compartmentalized. The Western worldview looks at the individual's relationship with God. That's religion, your religion. The individual's relationship with people, that's your ethics. The individual's relationship with the world, well, that's science. We divide everything up, and everything is focused on the individual. However, the African worldview is different. It recognizes God at the top, and then lesser gods and goddesses below, and then good and evil spirits beneath that, and then ancestors and the living dead below that, and then seers, witchers, and ordinary people, and then below people you have plants and animals, and these still have spiritual powers in the traditional African mindset. And all of these different levels, whether we're talking about God at the top or these lower spiritual beings, and then even what's below, everything's interconnected. It's not all split up into these neat compartments like Western thinking is. You don't think of yourself as an isolated individual. Rather, you're part of an interconnected spiritual ecosystem. You're being influenced by the forces and people and things around you all the time, and you're influencing them. So that's would you say it's pretty accurate?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So there's a significant difference. And let me tell you something about Christianity. Christianity could thrive if you're an individualist, and it can thrive if you're a communist, and it can thrive if you're an African, where you have all these spiritual powers. Christianity fits in any one of those cultures. There may be some areas in which you need to limit your thinking a little bit here or there, or expand it a little bit there. But Christianity is transcultural. It doesn't matter if you like fried food or if you like to eat only vegetables, you can still be a Christian. You know what I mean? And if you have a spiritual worldview, that's going to fit very well with the biblical worldview. So African Christians tend to exalt God as high and supreme. He's not my God, he's our God. He's the God of all. And the what I've seen about it is that Christians in Africa are more concerned about Muslims, because there are so many Muslims nearby, but they recognize that the Muslim God and the Christian God is the same God. Whereas in America, if you ask a Christian, do you worship the same God as the Muslims? Maybe, half of them will say, no, they worship Allah, I worship Yahweh. These are two different gods. So, but in Africa, they're more tended. There's a more of a tendency to see the high God as supreme overall. Salvation from a Western mindset is the idea many times of becoming purer. The idea of sanctification, subtracting sinful habits from your life over time. That's the process of salvation, right? From an African perspective, it's not about diminishing, it's about flourishing in the midst of life. Spiritually, physiologically, materially, total package, total flourishing. That's salvation from their perspective, which is probably why 70% of Africans, according to Douglas Jacobson, believe that God gives health and wealth to those who have sufficient faith, which in America we call the prosperity gospel. 35% of Africans of African Christians are Pentecostal. They believe that God is near and God intervenes. They don't believe in a distant God, they believe in a close God. They're also, of course, Catholic, Anglican, and other denominations as well. All right, let's talk about Christian variety in Africa just a little bit. And we're ahead of schedule, which is awesome, because I have some other things to add into the next one. So makes me very happy. All right, Christian variety. First of all, I want to say that Africa is not homogeneous. Africa is a continent, not a country. Africa has many regions that are very different from each other. It's a continent with huge regional differences. Some similarities between regions, but also major differences. So, for example, if we look at Egypt here in the northeast, that's where we kind of started out looking at Africa, is at Egypt, we can see that it's 90% Muslim and 10% Christian. 90% of the Christians are Orthodox, Coptic Orthodox. That's their preferred religious, brand. And in 2010 to 2012, when we had the Arab Spring and there were all these riots and fomenting of, turning over the government and all this actually increased the tensions between Muslims and Christians. It made it hard on our brothers and sisters there. The primary issue in Egypt for Christians, survival. They're just trying to survive. They're just trying not to get persecuted, trying to raise their kids, trying to be able to survive. Then we go to Nigeria. Here's a totally different country, Nigeria. Nigeria is 45% Christian, 45% Muslim, 8% traditional religion, and 2% other or secular. Out of the Christians, 1/3 of them are Pentecostal, 1/3 of them are Protestant, and 1/3 of them are Catholic. Talk about diversity.
Yeah.
Right? The north is Muslim, the south is Christian. And they have a terrorist group there, Boko Haram. It's a Muslim group that primarily attacks other Muslims who are not radical enough or are not committed enough, but it also attacks Christians sometimes. 75%, however, this is staggering, 75% of Christians say that Muslims are honest, hardworking people. 75% of Muslims say that Christians are good, honest people. So, sometimes you see these things, you're like, oh, they must be fighting all the time. Well, no, not all the time. Things break out from time to time, and that's terrible when that happens. But by and large, Christians, if you live near people, you get to know them, right? And what was the other stat? 60% of Christians are fine with a Muslim ruler being in charge of Nigeria, and 60% of Muslims are fine with a Christian ruler in charge of Nigeria. So you still got that 40% on either side, right? The more committed. The primary issue in Nigeria for Christians is peaceful coexistence with Muslim neighbors. So it's not survival, it's coexistence. Like how do we have peace, coexistence with Muslim neighbors? Then we consider South Africa, which is 83% Christian, 7% traditional, 8% other / non-religious, and 2% Muslim. Almost no Muslims at all, just 2%. In South Africa, they're 50% Pentecostal, 40% Protestant, 10% Catholic. So, and the Protestant is likely mostly Dutch Reformed. Their main issue is apartheid, or was apartheid, which enfranchised white and diminished black privileges. In 1990, apartheid was overthrown, and in 1994, Nelson Mandela was released from jail and became the president from 94 to 99 in South Africa. Desmond Tutu, an Anglican bishop, spearheaded the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that got people to admit to each other how they had participated in apartheid and got victims to offer forgiveness for how they were treated. The goal was to heal the wounds of apartheid. The primary challenge for Christians in South Africa is can the government be fair and just to everyone? Or is it just going to punish the white people for having been bad in the past or punish the black people is going to be fair? Is it going to be just? Today, Africa is 6 times larger than it was in 1885. However, the Christian population is 50 times larger than it was in 1885. So, I mean, look at that incredible growth. The population goes up by sixfold, but Christianity goes up by 50-fold. In 1900, 88% of Christians lived in Europe or North America. Think about that for a second. Almost 90% of all the Christians in the world lived in Europe or in North America. At the end of the 20th century, 60% of Christians live in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The majority has moved. Europe has waned. North America holds strong. But Christianity has spread like wildfire in these other places. It's predominantly, today, non-Western. Africa went from 10 million to 300 million in the 20th century. In the early part of the 21st as well. Africa has a special place in the plan of salvation, wouldn't you say? So Africa is a diverse, growing, and distinctive group of Christians in different areas. By 2025, some people are predicting that Christians in Africa will be more than anywhere else in the world. That there will be more Christians in Africa than any other continent. 2025 is it's only a few years away. It's not like a 100 years from now. Oh, maybe they'll. No, this is.
2025.
It's very.
5 years from
Yeah, it's very soon.
Talk
Right?
about the statistics. Yeah. This is good.
All right. So that's enough. Some encouraging news from Africa there.